Donald Trump just called himself Europe's father, and the most powerful woman in Brussels just proved him right by bending the knee. 90 billion euros in Ukraine aid, gone, stopped dead. Not by Russia, not by war fatigue, but by the man in the White House who told Ursula von der Leyen to her face, "You call me daddy now." What happened in the last 48 hours is not diplomacy, it is domination. And what comes next will decide whether Europe still exists as anything more than America's colony. Mark Rutte, the NATO chief who is your friend, called you daddy earlier. Do you regard your NATO allies as kind of children? No, he likes me. I think he likes me. If he doesn't, I'll let you know. I'll come back and I'll hit him hard, okay? No, he did it very affectionately. Daddy, you're my daddy. Do you regard your NATO allies, though, as kind of like children? And they're obviously listening to you and they're spending more. And you're obviously appreciative of that, but do you hope that actually they're going to be able to defend themselves, defend Europe on their own? I think they need help a little bit at the beginning, and I think they'll be able to. And I think they're going to remember this day. And this was a big day for NATO. This was a very big day. They took it. One of the gentlemen said, "You know what? We've been trying to raise money to raise the rate for 30 years. He said 20 years from almost the beginning, and he's been there for a long time. He said, until you came along, it never happened. What you did is amazing. It's been sort of an amazing day for a lot of reasons, but also for that. Yeah, go ahead. Do you think they can do it without you, though, in the future? Can they do it without the United States? I mean, you have to ask Mark. The collapse began not in Washington or Brussels, but in a private phone call that no transcript will ever fully capture. On Tuesday morning, Central European time, Ursula von der Leyen placed what her staff described as a routine coordination call to the White House. She expected a standard exchange on transatlantic cooperation. What she got instead was a verbal execution. Donald Trump did not wait for pleasantries. He did not ask how she was doing. He opened with a single question that sources inside the room say was delivered with the tone of a man who already knew the answer. Are you going to keep funding a war you cannot win? Or are you going to listen to your father? It started with good news for Europe and Ukraine. In spring, we said that we would deliver on the 90 billion loan for Ukraine one way or the other. Now we have made good on this promise. We will disperse the first tranche of 45 billion euros for 2026. Still this quarter, 1/3 for budgetary needs and 2/3 go to Ukraine's defense. And the first defense package will be on drones from Ukraine to Ukraine, worth some 6 billion euros. So our message is very clear. We will continue our support for the brave Ukrainian people and their armed forces. While Russia is doubling down on its aggression, Europe doubles down on its support for Ukraine. That day, we also adopted the 20th sanctions package. And yes, the sanctions are biting. They are having a biting effect on the Russian economy, with inflation increasing and interest rates skyrocketing. The consequences of Russia's war of choice are also being paid for out of Russian people's pockets, so much so that the Kremlin responds in an unusual way by restricting the internet and free communication. Von der Leyen, according to insiders, went silent for several seconds. Then Trump continued. You have been spending European taxpayer money like it grows on trees. 90 billion euros to Ukraine while your own people freeze because you sanctioned Russian gas to make me happy 2 years ago. And now you want to keep going. You are going to stop, or I am going to stop you. The European Commission president attempted to push back, citing commitments to Kyiv, the strategic importance of supporting Ukraine, and the moral obligation to resist aggression. Trump cut her off mid-sentence. I do not care about your morals. I care about results. You lost. Russia is winning. Your sanctions failed. Your weapons barely work, and your money is gone. So here is what happens next. You announce that the aid package is under review. You freeze the funds. You tell Zelensky the well is running dry. And then you call me back, and we talk about what Europe is going to do to earn my protection going forward. Von der Leyen reportedly asked what he meant by protection. Trump's response, leaked within hours to 3 separate European news outlets, was blunt and chilling. You think NATO is still protecting you? NATO is whatever I say it is. And right now, I say it protects the countries that act like allies, not the ones that act like spoiled children spending daddy's money on losing wars. The call ended there. No agreement, no compromise, just a demand and a threat. Within 6 hours, the European Commission issued a statement announcing an immediate comprehensive review of all ongoing financial assistance programs to Ukraine. The language was bureaucratic and carefully neutral, but the substance was unmistakable. The 90 billion euro package, which had been publicly championed by von der Leyen herself just 3 weeks earlier, was now in limbo. The markets understood before the politicians did. European stock indexes began sliding within minutes of the announcement. The euro dropped against the dollar. Bond yields spiked across southern Europe as investors recalculated the risk of holding debt in a bloc that could no longer guarantee its own policy independence. Energy futures surged on fears that American pressure could force Europe into even deeper dependence on liquefied natural gas imports from the United States at prices Washington would dictate. This was not a market correction. This was a market panic, and the cause was not economic data or corporate earnings. It was the realization that Europe's largest institution had just been publicly bent into submission by a single phone call from a man who was not even trying to hide what he was doing. The reaction inside the European Union was immediate and volcanic. In Berlin, Chancellor Friedrich Merz convened an emergency meeting of his cabinet and reportedly spent the first 20 minutes shouting at his foreign minister for failing to anticipate Trump's move. Germany, which had been the largest single contributor to the Ukraine aid package, now found itself trapped between maintaining credibility with Kyiv and avoiding a catastrophic rupture with Washington. Merz's government, already fragile and ruling with a slim coalition, could not survive both. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron issued a defiant statement calling the pressure campaign unacceptable interference in European sovereignty. But privately, French diplomats were sending frantic cables to Brussels, asking whether the aid freeze was final and what concessions had been offered to Trump in exchange. Macron's rhetoric was bold. His actions were paralyzed. And in Warsaw, the response was pure rage. Poland, which shares a border with Ukraine and has absorbed millions of refugees, viewed the aid package as an existential security investment, not charity. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk released a statement that barely concealed his contempt for both von der Leyen and the Western European leaders he believed had caved to American pressure. "If we abandon Ukraine now, we are next," Tusk declared. And those who think appeasing Trump will save them are the same fools who thought appeasing Hitler would bring peace. The comparison was inflammatory and deliberate, and it landed like a grenade inside an already fracturing alliance. But the most revealing reaction came not from a major power, but from Hungary. Viktor Orban, who had opposed the Ukraine aid package from the beginning and had been isolated and condemned for his position, issued a brief statement that dripped with vindication. President Trump understands what Brussels refuses to accept. Peace requires realism, not endless subsidies for a conflict that cannot be won. Hungary welcomes this necessary course correction. Orban had read the situation perfectly. While the rest of Europe scrambled to salvage credibility, he was positioning himself as a leader who had been right all along. And Trump, watching from Washington, took notice. What happened next made it clear that this was not just about Ukraine. It was about who gives the orders in the Western world. And the answer was about to get a lot more expensive for anyone who still thought Europe had a choice. Donald Trump stood in the Rose Garden, flanked by Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Trade Representative Jameson Greer, and unveiled what he called the Atlantic Rebalancing Initiative. The name was polite. The content was a declaration of economic warfare. Effective immediately, the United States would impose a baseline 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports from the European Union. Automotive imports from Germany, Italy, and France would face a 35% levy. Luxury goods, including wine, cheese, fashion, and pharmaceuticals, would be subject to what the administration termed reciprocal taxation, meaning whatever Europe charged American products, the United States would double it. But the most devastating component was buried in the technical language of the executive order. Any European company doing business with firms or entities that provided material support to Ukraine's war effort would be subject to secondary sanctions, effectively cutting them off from the American financial system. This was not a tariff package. This was a hostage situation. European corporations could either keep trading with America or keep supporting Ukraine. They could not do both, and every CEO on the continent knew which choice their shareholders would demand. The European automotive sector, already struggling with the transition to electric vehicles and increased competition from China, faced annihilation. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Stellantis had built their entire export strategies around American market access. Losing it would trigger mass layoffs across Germany, France, and Italy within months. The luxury goods industry, which had enjoyed decades of premium pricing in American markets, watched its profit margins evaporate overnight. French vintners, Italian designers, and Swiss watchmakers faced a choice between accepting crippling tariffs or abandoning the wealthiest consumer market on the planet. Agricultural exporters from Spain, the Netherlands, and Ireland found themselves priced out of American grocery chains and restaurant supply networks. Jobs, revenues, and entire regional economies built on transatlantic trade were collapsing in real time. And Trump was not finished. At the same press conference, he casually mentioned that the United States was reviewing its liquefied natural gas export allocations to ensure that American energy went to partners who shared American values and supported American leadership. The implication was immediate and unmistakable. Europe, which had become desperately dependent on American LNG after cutting off Russian pipeline gas, could see its energy supplies restricted or redirected to other buyers. Germany, which had mothballed its nuclear plants and bet its entire energy future on imports, faced the prospect of industrial shutdowns and rolling blackouts if American gas shipments were reduced. Poland and the Baltic states, which had built new LNG terminals specifically to receive American fuel, suddenly realized that their energy security was not guaranteed by contracts or infrastructure, but by the political mood of one man in Washington. The economic pressure was brutal, but the psychological warfare was worse. Trump did not stop at policy announcements. He turned the conflict into a personal humiliation campaign aimed directly at von der Leyen. In a Truth Social post that went viral within minutes, he wrote, "Ursula called me to beg for a deal. I said, first, you stop the Ukraine money. She said, yes, Mr. President. I said, you can call me Daddy. She laughed. Then she did exactly what Daddy told her to do. Europe is finally learning respect." The post was crude, demeaning, and almost certainly exaggerated. But it did not matter whether the conversation had actually happened that way. What mattered was that Trump had said it publicly, that von der Leyen had not denied it, and that the entire world was now watching to see if the president of the European Commission would defend her dignity or swallow the insult in silence. She chose silence. The European Commission issued no rebuttal, no clarification, no pushback. Von der Leyen's office released a bland statement about maintaining open channels of communication with all partners. The absence of a denial was itself the story, and in capitals across Europe, leaders drew the obvious conclusion. If the head of the European Commission would not stand up to Trump's mockery, then the institution she led had no credibility left to defend. The fractures inside the European Union, which had been widening for years, now split wide open. A bloc of nations led by Poland, the Baltic states, and the Czech Republic issued a joint declaration condemning the aid freeze and calling for an immediate restoration of the full €90 billion package regardless of American pressure. They argued that capitulation to Trump would embolden not just Washington, but Moscow, Beijing, and every other power that saw European weakness as an opportunity. But they were a minority and they knew it. The larger economies, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, were paralyzed by competing pressures. Their defense establishments wanted to support Ukraine. Their intelligence agencies warned that abandoning Kiev would destabilize the entire eastern flank. But their business lobbies, their export-dependent industries, and their energy-dependent populations were screaming for a deal with Washington at any price. In Madrid, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez faced mass protests from agricultural workers who had just lost their American contracts. In Rome, Giorgia Meloni's government teetered as coalition partners demanded she choose between defending European solidarity and protecting Italian jobs. In Berlin, Merz's approval ratings collapsed as voters who had supported Ukraine aid in principle now turned against it when the cost became their own economic survival. And in Paris, Macron's calls for strategic autonomy rang hollow when French corporations were quietly lobbying the Élysée Palace to cut a separate deal with Trump to preserve their market access. The emergency summit convened in Brussels was less a negotiation than a collective nervous breakdown. 27 heads of state gathered in a room designed for unity and spent 11 hours tearing each other apart. Eastern European leaders accused their Western counterparts of cowardice and betrayal. Southern European leaders blamed Northern European fiscal rigidity for leaving them vulnerable to economic shocks. Macron tried to position France as the defender of European sovereignty, but was openly mocked by Polish and Baltic representatives who pointed out that French companies were already quietly complying with American demands. Merz offered financial compensation to countries most affected by the trade war, but refused to commit Germany to any policy that would further antagonize Washington. The summit produced no joint statement, no unified position, no coordinated response. It produced only a scheduled follow-up meeting in 2 weeks, which everyone in the room understood was code for. We have no idea what to do, and we are hoping the problem solves itself. It would not, because while Europe argued with itself, Trump was already moving to the next phase. And this one would not involve phone calls or tariffs. This one would involve a direct challenge to the one thing Europe still believed it controlled. The question was no longer whether Europe would resist. The question was whether Europe could resist. The betrayal came from the one place von der Leyen never expected. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president whose survival had depended entirely on European financial support, whose speeches had moved European parliaments to tears, and whose war had unified the continent against Russia for the first time in decades, was now sitting across from Donald Trump in the Oval Office, shaking hands on a deal that cut Brussels out completely. The meeting was announced with zero advance notice. No European leader was consulted. No European diplomat was invited. Zelensky flew directly from Kiev to Washington and walked into the White House as if the 90 billion euro aid freeze had never happened, because it had not happened to him. It had happened to Europe. Trump's offer was simple and surgical. The United States would provide $20 billion in direct military aid to Ukraine, bypassing European institutions entirely. American weapons, American intelligence, American contractors. In exchange, Zelensky would publicly support a negotiated settlement framework that gave Russia territorial concessions in the east while preserving Ukrainian sovereignty elsewhere. The deal was not peace. It was managed conflict, and it was designed to prove one thing, that America could solve Europe's problems without Europe. Zelensky's acceptance shattered the last illusion of European leverage. Von der Leyen had frozen the aid to prove she still controlled the process. Trump had simply gone around her and made her irrelevant. The images of Zelensky and Trump together in the Oval Office, smiling, shaking hands, signing documents, played on every screen across the continent. And in every capital, the message was received with perfect clarity. Europe no longer mattered. The father had spoken. The children had no choice but to obey. If this story shook you, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what comes next is even more explosive. The world order you grew up with is dead, and most people will not see the new one coming until it crushes them. This channel does not follow the mainstream lies. We show you the truth they are terrified to admit. Comment below. Is Europe finished, or can it fight back? Share this with everyone who needs to wake up. The next video drops soon. Do not miss it.